The kingdom of Israel had known many triumphs under the reign of King David, a ruler beloved by his people and revered as a man after God's own heart. David had led his people through wars and battles, securing the land that God had promised them. His victories over enemies, his establishment of Jerusalem as the political and spiritual center, and his deep connection with God were all part of the legacy that defined him. But now, David was growing old. His once mighty body had become frail, and the weight of his years as king had taken its toll. The days of leading armies into battle and standing at the forefront of Israel's triumphs were behind him. David knew that his time as ruler was nearing its end. He would often sit alone in his chambers, his mind drifting back over the years of his reign, the battles, the triumphs, the mistakes, and the moments when he felt God's guiding hand upon him. He thought of his past, of his rise from a shepherd boy to king, and of the future of the kingdom he had built. As he looked to the horizon of time, one question weighed heavily on his heart. Who would take the throne after him? Among David's many sons, there was one who stood out in his mind: Solomon, his son with Bathsheba. Solomon was not the eldest of David's sons, nor was he the most experienced in matters of war or governance. But there was something about him that set him apart from the others. Solomon possessed a quiet strength, a sense of destiny that David could not ignore. More importantly, David believed that God had chosen Solomon to succeed him, and he felt a deep sense of peace when he thought about Solomon's future. However, the decision to anoint Solomon as king would not be without its challenges. David's other sons, especially Adonijah, had their own ambitions. Adonijah, the fourth son of David, had already begun to position himself as the next ruler, gathering support from influential figures in the kingdom and preparing for his rise to power. The tension within the royal family was palpable, and David knew that if he did not act swiftly, the kingdom could be thrown into chaos. David, despite his age and frailty, summoned his inner strength and resolved to ensure that the transition of power would be peaceful and according to God's will. He turned to the people he trusted the most: Bathsheba, the mother of Solomon, and Nathan, the prophet who had guided him throughout his reign. Together, they devised a plan to secure Solomon's place as the rightful heir to the throne. Nathan, a prophet and one of David's closest advisors, played a crucial role in this decision. He had been with David through many of the highs and lows of his reign, offering counsel and speaking on behalf of God. Nathan knew that it was God's will for Solomon to succeed David, and he supported the king in ensuring that this would happen. With Bathsheba's encouragement and Nathan's guidance, David made the momentous decision to anoint Solomon as his successor, setting in motion a series of events that would shape the future of Israel for generations to come. The day of Solomon's anointing was one of both celebration and uncertainty. As word spread throughout Israel that David was preparing to name a successor, the people of the kingdom were filled with anticipation. They had heard of the inner conflicts within the royal family, and many wondered what the future would hold. Would Solomon, a young and relatively inexperienced man, be able to rule with the same strength and wisdom as his father? Could he carry the weight of the legacy that David was leaving behind? In a public and solemn ceremony, Solomon was anointed with oil, a sacred act that signified God's blessing upon him as the new king of Israel. The prophet Nathan spoke words of blessing over Solomon, calling upon God to grant him wisdom, strength, and guidance as he prepared to lead the nation. The people of Israel, who had gathered to witness the event, cheered as Solomon was officially declared the new ruler of Israel. The sound of their voices echoed through the streets of Jerusalem, a city that had witnessed the rise of kings and the fall of empires. But Solomon's anointing was more than just a passing of the crown from father to son. It was the continuation of a legacy, a testament to the enduring strength and wisdom of the Israelite kingdom. For the people of Israel, Solomon's anointing was a sign that God's hand was still upon them, guiding them into a new era of leadership and prosperity. As Solomon stood before the people, the weight of responsibility settled upon his shoulders. He was young, inexperienced in the ways of war and governance, but he carried with him the hopes and dreams of his people. They looked to him not just as their king, but as their guide, their protector, and their connection to God. The mantle of kingship had been passed to him, And now, it was up to Solomon to prove himself worthy of the title. In the early days of his reign, Solomon felt the magnitude of the task before him. He knew that his father's shoes were large to fill. David had been a man of great faith, a warrior king who had expanded Israel's territory and secured peace. But Solomon, despite being David's son, was different. He was not a man of war. He was a man of wisdom, and he knew that in order to lead Israel, he would need something more than military might. He would need wisdom to govern with justice and righteousness. And so, in a gesture of humility and devotion, Solomon sought God's guidance. He knew that the throne had been given to him by God, and he was determined to rule in a way that honored that divine trust. Early in his reign, Solomon traveled to Gibeon, where the tabernacle of the Lord was located. There, in the quietness of the night, surrounded by the sacred symbols of God's presence, Solomon offered sacrifices to the Lord, seeking his favor and guidance. That night, as Solomon laid down to rest, God appeared to him in a dream. It was a moment that would change the course of Solomon's life and the future of Israel forever. In the dream, God spoke to Solomon, saying, "Ask for whatever you want me to give you." It was an extraordinary offer, one that would leave most men grappling with thoughts of wealth, power, or the lives of their enemies. But Solomon, with his heart full of humility and a deep sense of responsibility, was not like most men. Solomon's father, King David, had taught him that the throne of Israel was not just a seat of power, but a sacred duty. To rule God's chosen people was to carry the weight of their hopes, their fears, and their very future. The young king felt the enormity of this responsibility, and he knew that it was beyond his own human abilities to govern such a great nation wisely. He was, after all, still a young man, inexperienced and, in his own words, like a little child. In his dream, Solomon's response was immediate and sincere. "Lord my God, you have made your servant king in place of my father David, but I am only a little child and do not know how to carry out my duties. Your servant is here among the people you have chosen, a great people, too numerous to count or number. So give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. For who is able to govern this great people of yours?" There was no desire for riches, no longing for power, nor a plea for the defeat of his enemies. Solomon's request was simple and pure. He sought the wisdom to lead his people with justice and righteousness. God was pleased. The sincerity of Solomon's request touched the heart of the Almighty, and his response was filled with grace and blessing. "Since you have asked for this, and not for long life or wealth for yourself, nor have you asked for the death of your enemies, but for discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be." But God did not stop there. Because Solomon had chosen wisdom over personal gain, God also promised him riches and honor beyond compare. "Moreover, I will give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life." Solomon awoke from his dream with a sense of awe and purpose. He knew that God had answered his prayer, and the wisdom he had sought would guide him throughout his reign. The young king returned to Jerusalem, filled with new resolve, ready to govern his people with the wisdom granted by God himself. As Solomon began his reign, it didn't take long for his newfound wisdom to be tested. One day, 2 women came before him, each claiming to be the mother of a newborn baby. The women were not strangers. They lived together in the same house and had given birth to their babies around the same time. But tragedy struck when one of the babies died during the night. In her grief, the woman whose child had died switched the infants, placing her dead baby beside the other woman while she slept and taking the living child for herself. Now, both women stood before King Solomon, each passionately claiming that the living child was hers. The courtroom was tense as the women pleaded their case, their voices filled with desperation. Both mothers were adamant, and it seemed impossible to determine who was telling the truth. This was no ordinary case. It wasn't just a matter of wealth or property, but a life, the life of a child and the love of a mother. The people watching in the courtroom, and those who would later hear of this dispute, wondered how even the wisest of kings could resolve such a delicate matter. But Solomon, guided by the divine wisdom that God had granted him, devised a clever plan to reveal the truth. He called for a sword, and to the shock of everyone present, he made a chilling decree: cut the living child in two, and give half to one and half to the other. Gasps filled the courtroom as the order was given. It seemed like a cruel and unimaginable solution. But Solomon knew what he was doing. He understood that the true mother would reveal herself in this moment of crisis. At once, the first woman, the one whose child was truly alive, cried out in horror, "Please, my lord, give her the living baby. Don't kill him." Her heart could not bear the thought of her child being harmed, even if it meant losing him to the other woman. In contrast, the second woman, her voice cold and bitter, said, "Neither I nor you shall have him. Cut him in two." Solomon had his answer. The woman who would rather lose her child than see him harmed was the true mother. With calm and authority, Solomon ordered the child to be given to the first woman, declaring, "Give the living baby to the first woman. Do not kill him. She's his mother." The people marveled at Solomon's wisdom. News of this judgment spread quickly throughout Israel and beyond, and soon all of Israel came to understand that God had indeed given their king exceptional wisdom and discernment. This was no ordinary ruler. Solomon was blessed by God with a heart that could see beyond the surface of human disputes, a mind that could uncover hidden truths, and a spirit that sought justice for all. As the years passed, Solomon's wisdom became known throughout the land and even far beyond the borders of Israel. People from distant lands came to hear his counsel and seek his judgment, amazed by the depth of his insight and the fairness of his rulings. His name became synonymous with wisdom, and his early reign was marked by peace, prosperity, and the admiration of his people. God's promise to Solomon extended beyond wisdom. As he had said, Solomon's wealth and honor grew alongside his reputation for wisdom. Foreign dignitaries, merchants, and kings sent gifts of gold, silver, and precious goods to the young king, eager to gain his favor. Solomon's court was filled with treasures from across the world, and his kingdom became known for its splendor and grandeur. But even as Solomon's fame spread and his wealth multiplied, he never forgot the source of his wisdom. He continued to offer sacrifices to God and sought his guidance in all matters of governance. The people of Israel flourished under Solomon's leadership, and his name became a beacon of hope, justice, and prosperity. Solomon's reign, however, was only just beginning. As his power grew, so did his ambition, and soon, the young king would turn his attention to a project that would define his legacy: the construction of a temple, a house for the Lord, that would become the centerpiece of Israelite worship and the most magnificent structure the kingdom had ever seen. The building of the temple and the kingdom's prosperity. As Solomon's reputation for wisdom grew, so did his vision for the future of Israel. His early reign had been marked by justice, prosperity, and the admiration of his people. But Solomon knew that his legacy would not be complete without fulfilling the dream his father, King David, had cherished: the building of a grand temple, a permanent home for the Ark of the Covenant, and a place where the people of Israel could worship their God. David had long desired to build a temple for the Lord, a place worthy of the God who had brought Israel out of Egypt and led them to victory over their enemies. However, God had told David that it would not be his task to build the temple. Instead, that honor would fall to his son Solomon. Now, with his reign secure and peace established in the land, Solomon knew the time had come to fulfill his father's dream and to build a temple that would stand as a testament to the glory of God and the strength of Israel. The scope of the project was immense. Solomon's vision for the temple was not just for a place of worship. It would be the spiritual and cultural heart of the nation, a symbol of the covenant between God and his people. The temple would become the center of Israelite life, where sacrifices would be made, prayers would be offered, and the presence of God would dwell among his people. To achieve this, Solomon spared no expense. He knew that such an undertaking required the best materials and the most skilled craftsmen, so he turned to his ally, King Hiram of Tyre. Hiram, a friend of David's, was a skilled diplomat and ruler of a prosperous kingdom known for its wealth and expertise in building. Solomon sent word to Hiram asking for his help in the construction of the temple. Hiram responded with enthusiasm. He admired Solomon's wisdom and was eager to continue the friendly relations that had existed between their two kingdoms during David's reign. "Praise be to the Lord today," Hiram wrote in his reply to Solomon, "for he has given David a wise son to rule over this great nation." The two kings struck an agreement. Hiram would supply Solomon with the finest cedar and cypress logs from the forests of Lebanon, as well as skilled laborers and craftsmen to work alongside Solomon's builders. In return, Solomon provided Hiram with vast quantities of wheat, olive oil, and wine, ensuring a steady trade between the two nations. This partnership allowed Solomon to access the materials and expertise he needed to build a temple unlike anything the world had ever seen. The construction of the temple began in the 4th year of Solomon's reign. It was a massive undertaking, requiring years of labor from tens of thousands of workers. Men were sent to the quarries to cut and shape large stones for the temple's foundation and walls. Others labored to transport the massive cedar logs from Lebanon to Jerusalem, a journey that took great effort and coordination. Craftsmen from Israel and Tyre worked side by side, carving intricate designs into the stones and preparing the wood for the temple's beams and doors. Solomon's commitment to excellence extended to every aspect of the temple's construction. Nothing was left to chance, and every detail was carefully planned. The outer walls of the temple were constructed from massive stone blocks, each one cut to perfection to fit seamlessly into place. The interior of the temple was equally impressive. The walls were paneled with cedar and covered with pure gold, while the floors were paved with intricately patterned stones. Skilled craftsmen carved designs of cherubim, palm trees, and flowers into the wood and stone, filling the temple with symbols of life and divinity. But the heart of the temple was the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space in all of Israel. It was here that the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence and the covenant with his people, would rest. Only the high priest, once a year on the Day of Atonement, would be allowed to enter this sacred space to offer prayers and sacrifices on behalf of the people. The walls of the Holy of Holies were overlaid with gold, and the room was filled with a sense of awe and reverence, for it was believed that God himself would dwell there. Outside the temple, 2 massive bronze pillars were erected at the entrance. These pillars, named Jachin and Boaz, were adorned with decorative capitals and stood as symbols of strength and stability. Cast by Hiram, the master craftsman sent by the king of Tyre, these pillars were a marvel of engineering and artistry. They stood as silent guardians at the entrance to the temple, welcoming all who came to worship. The construction of the temple took 7 years to complete, and when it was finished, it was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It was not just a building, it was a monument to the faith of Israel and the glory of their God. The temple shone with gold and reflected the wealth and devotion of a kingdom at peace, led by a king blessed with wisdom and favored by God. When the temple was finally completed, Solomon organized a great dedication ceremony. The Ark of the Covenant was brought from the city of David to its new home in the temple. The Levites, who had been entrusted with caring for the Ark, carried it on their shoulders, while the priests and people of Israel followed in procession, singing psalms of praise and thanksgiving. The sight of the Ark being carried into the temple brought tears to the eyes of many, for it was a powerful reminder of the covenant between God and his people. As the Ark was placed in the Holy of Holies, a great cloud filled the temple, a sign that the presence of God had descended upon the place. Solomon, standing before the altar, offered a prayer of dedication. "The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." Solomon's prayer was one of humility and devotion. He asked God to hear the prayers of his people, to bless the nation of Israel, and to forgive their sins when they turned to him in repentance. As Solomon prayed, the glory of the Lord filled the temple, and the people fell to their knees in worship. It was a moment of profound spiritual significance, not just for Solomon, but for the entire nation of Israel. The temple stood as a symbol of God's presence among his people, a place where they could come to seek his guidance, offer sacrifices, and find forgiveness. The completion of the temple marked a high point in Solomon's reign. It was a time of peace and prosperity, a golden age for Israel. The people flourished, and the kingdom expanded its influence through trade and diplomacy. Solomon's wisdom and leadership brought wealth and honor to the nation, and Israel became a beacon of light in a world filled with darkness. Solomon's court was filled with treasures from across the world. Gold, silver, precious stones, and fine textiles were brought from far-off lands as tribute to the great king. Solomon's wealth was unmatched, and his kingdom became known far and wide for its prosperity and splendor. Foreign rulers came to seek his counsel, and merchants from distant lands traveled to Israel to trade their goods. Under Solomon's leadership, Israel's borders expanded and its influence grew. The king's wisdom extended beyond matters of governance and justice. He was also a master of diplomacy, forming alliances with neighboring kingdoms and securing peace through strategic marriages and treaties. Solomon's reign brought stability to the region, and for the first time in many generations, the people of Israel could enjoy the blessings of peace. But even in the midst of this prosperity, Solomon knew that the true source of his success was not his wealth or his alliances. It was the wisdom and favor of God. He had built a temple not for his own glory, but to honor the God who had led his people out of Egypt and into the Promised Land. And as long as Solomon remained faithful to the Lord, his reign would continue to be blessed. However, as the years passed and Solomon's power grew, so did his ambitions. The wealth and prosperity that marked his reign would soon become a double-edged sword, leading him down a path of temptation that would test his loyalty to the God who had given him everything. The visit of the Queen of Sheba. As Solomon's fame spread far and wide, his reputation for wisdom, wealth, and divine favor reached the ears of rulers from distant lands. Kings and queens, intrigued by the tales of his brilliance and the prosperity of Israel, sent emissaries to seek his counsel, offer tributes, and forge alliances. Among those who heard of Solomon's greatness was a ruler from a distant and wealthy kingdom. The Queen of Sheba, known for her own wisdom and wealth, ruled a prosperous land south of Israel. She had heard tales of Solomon's unmatched wisdom, his magnificent temple, and the splendor of his court. These stories of the great king of Israel piqued her curiosity, and she resolved to see for herself if the tales were true. She was not a woman easily impressed, and she sought to test Solomon with hard questions and riddles, hoping to gauge the depth of his understanding. The journey from Sheba to Jerusalem was long and arduous, but the queen did not come alone. She traveled with a magnificent entourage, caravans laden with spices, gold, precious stones, and other luxurious gifts. Her arrival in Jerusalem was nothing short of a spectacle, and the people marveled at the grandeur of her retinue. It was clear that the Queen of Sheba was no ordinary visitor. She had come not only to honor Solomon, but to witness firsthand the legendary wisdom and wealth that had made him famous. When the Queen of Sheba was welcomed into Solomon's court, she was immediately struck by the splendor of his kingdom. The palace, the temple, the grand halls adorned with gold and precious stones, all exceeded her expectations. But it was Solomon himself who captivated her the most. His demeanor was calm and confident, his words thoughtful and measured, and his presence commanded respect. During her visit, the queen presented Solomon with the riddles and questions she had prepared, testing the limits of his knowledge and wisdom. But to her astonishment, Solomon answered every question with ease. Whether it was a matter of philosophy, theology, nature, or governance, Solomon's wisdom seemed boundless. The queen was deeply impressed, not only by his intellect, but by the humility and grace with which he shared his knowledge. As the days passed, the Queen of Sheba observed more than just Solomon's wisdom. She took note of the orderliness of his kingdom, the justice of his rulings, and the happiness of his people. She saw the magnificence of the temple he had built for the Lord and the reverence with which the people worshipped their God. The queen could see that Solomon's wisdom was not just a gift for himself. It had transformed the entire nation of Israel, bringing peace, prosperity, and a deep sense of purpose to the land. Finally, The Queen of Sheba could contain her admiration no longer. She stood before Solomon and said, "The report I heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth you have far exceeded the report I heard. How happy your people must be. How happy your officials, who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom." She went on to praise the God of Israel, saying, "Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of the Lord's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness." The queen's words were not just flattery, they were a sincere acknowledgement of the greatness she had witnessed. Before departing, the Queen of Sheba presented Solomon with gifts that were as magnificent as her admiration for him. 120 talents of gold, a vast quantity of spices, and precious stones. The spices she brought were said to be of such high quality that never again were such spices brought into Israel. Solomon, in turn, gave the queen gifts of equal magnificence, a gesture of respect and goodwill between their two kingdoms. The visit of the Queen of Sheba was more than just a diplomatic encounter. It was a moment that solidified Solomon's reputation on the world stage. Here was a king who was not only wealthy and powerful, but also wise beyond measure. A king whose fame extended far beyond the borders of Israel. As the queen departed, her heart was filled with awe and admiration for Solomon and his God. She returned to her own kingdom with tales of the greatness she had witnessed, stories that would inspire and intrigue the people of Sheba for generations to come. The Queen of Sheba's visit marked a high point in Solomon's reign. His wisdom, wealth, and influence had reached their zenith, and Israel stood as a shining example of what could be achieved when a nation followed the wisdom of God. Solomon's court became a place of learning and diplomacy, where scholars and rulers from distant lands came to seek knowledge and understanding. But even as Solomon's fame spread, so too did his desire for more. His wealth grew, and with it came the trappings of power, palaces, chariots, horses, and riches beyond imagination. Foreign nations continued to send tributes, and Israel's borders expanded through trade and diplomacy. Solomon had everything a king could desire, yet his heart was restless. The more he achieved, the more he sought, and the more he sought, the further he strayed from the path of humility and devotion that had once defined him. Solomon began to take many wives, forming political alliances with the nations around him. These women came from foreign lands, and with them, they brought their gods and their customs. Over time, Solomon's devotion to the Lord began to wane, and his heart turned away from the one true God who had given him everything. The Queen of Sheba had seen Solomon at the height of his wisdom and glory, but even she could not have foreseen the downfall that awaited him. For in his pursuit of wealth, power, and pleasure, Solomon would soon lose sight of the very wisdom that had brought him such greatness. Solomon's decline and disobedience. As the years passed, Solomon's reign, once marked by wisdom and devotion to God, began to take a darker turn. The peace and prosperity that had defined his early years were still present, but underneath the surface, cracks were beginning to form. Solomon, the king who had once humbly asked for wisdom to govern his people, was now consumed by his ever-growing wealth and power. Solomon's kingdom had become the envy of the world. Gold flowed into Jerusalem from distant lands, and his court was filled with treasures beyond imagination: gems, silver, spices, horses, and chariots. His palaces were lavish, his fleets of ships brought goods from the farthest corners of the earth, and his influence extended across the region. But with this wealth came temptations that Solomon could not resist. The king, in his quest to secure peace and expand his influence, began to take many wives, forming alliances with the nations around Israel. These women were not Israelites. They came from foreign lands: Egypt, Moab, Ammon, Sidon, and many other places. Each of these foreign wives brought with them their gods and customs, and over time, they turned Solomon's heart away from the God of Israel. It began slowly at first. Solomon, eager to please his wives and maintain peace with their homelands, allowed them to practice their religions in secret. But soon, temples and high places were being built, not just for the Lord, but for the gods of Solomon's foreign wives. On the hills outside Jerusalem, altars were raised to the false gods: Ashtoreth, the goddess of the Sidonians; Molech, the detestable god of the Ammonites; and Chemosh, the god of the Moabites. For the first time in his life, Solomon's heart was divided. He had always been a man of wisdom, but now his loyalty was being tested. His wives, beautiful and persuasive, began to influence him in ways he had never anticipated. Solomon, who had once been so devoted to the God who had blessed him with wisdom and wealth, now found himself making compromises that would have been unthinkable in his younger years. As Solomon's devotion to the Lord waned, so too did the blessings that had once defined his reign. The peace and prosperity of Israel began to show signs of strain. God had warned the kings of Israel not to take many wives or accumulate vast amounts of wealth, for such things would lead them away from him. Yet, Solomon, despite all his wisdom, had ignored these warnings. God, displeased with Solomon's disobedience, sent prophets to warn him of the consequences of his actions. The message was clear: if Solomon continued to turn away from God and lead Israel into idolatry, there would be severe consequences. The kingdom, which had been united under David and Solomon, would be torn apart. But Solomon, blinded by his power and the influence of his wives, ignored the warnings. He continued to build altars for foreign gods, and the people of Israel, seeing their king's example, began to follow his lead. It wasn't long before adversaries began to rise against Solomon. Hadad the Edomite, who had been a thorn in Israel's side during David's reign, re-emerged, leading raids against Israel's borders. Rezon, the son of Eliada, gathered forces in the north and became a constant threat to Israel's peace. These adversaries were more than just military threats. They were signs that God's favor was no longer upon Solomon. But the greatest threat came from within. Among Solomon's own people, a young man named Jeroboam began to rise to prominence. Jeroboam was a capable and ambitious leader, and he quickly gained the loyalty of many in Israel. One day, as Jeroboam was leaving Jerusalem, the prophet Ahijah approached him with a message from the Lord. Ahijah tore his cloak into 12 pieces and gave 10 of them to Jeroboam, saying, "Take 10 pieces for yourself, for this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. See, I am going to tear the kingdom out of Solomon's hand and give you 10 tribes. But for the sake of my servant David and the city of Jerusalem, which I have chosen, he will have 1 tribe." The message was clear. Because of Solomon's disobedience, the kingdom of Israel would be divided. 10 of the 12 tribes would be given to Jeroboam, and only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin would remain under the rule of Solomon's descendants. This division would mark the end of the united kingdom that David had fought so hard to establish. When Solomon learned of this prophecy, he was filled with anger and sought to kill Jeroboam. But Jeroboam fled to Egypt, where he would remain until Solomon's death. The once great king, who had been renowned for his wisdom and justice, was now consumed by fear and paranoia, lashing out at those he saw as threats to his throne. As Solomon grew older, the weight of his choices began to take a toll on him. His once keen mind, which had solved the most difficult problems and dispensed justice with ease, now seemed clouded by regret and sorrow. The foreign gods he had allowed into Israel, the alliances he had formed with pagan nations, and the wealth that had once brought him joy, now felt like chains around his heart. Solomon, in his later years, began to reflect on the vanity of his pursuits. He had been given everything: wisdom, wealth, power, and yet, in the end, none of it had brought him lasting satisfaction. In the book of Ecclesiastes, traditionally attributed to Solomon, he writes, "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? Meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless." Solomon, the man who had once been the wisest and richest king in the world, had come to realize that all his achievements were fleeting. His vast wealth, his grand palaces, his many wives, none of it mattered in the face of eternity. He had turned away from God, and in doing so, he had lost the only thing that could give his life true meaning. In his final reflections, Solomon acknowledged that the only thing that mattered was a life lived in obedience to God. He concluded Ecclesiastes with these words, "Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man." It was a sobering realization for a king who had once had everything, only to discover that without God, it was all for nothing. Solomon's later years were marked by regret and a sense of loss. He had been given wisdom and wealth beyond measure, but his heart had strayed from the God who had blessed him with these gifts. The consequences of his disobedience were severe. The kingdom of Israel would be divided after his death, and the glory of the United Kingdom would never be fully restored. As Solomon's life came to an end, his reign was remembered as one of both great triumph and great tragedy. His wisdom had brought peace and prosperity to Israel, but his disobedience had led to its downfall. The story of Solomon serves as a powerful reminder that even the wisest and most blessed among us are not immune to the dangers of pride, temptation, and turning away from God. Conclusion and lessons from Solomon's life. The life of Solomon, king of Israel, is a story of both incredible success and profound tragedy. He began his reign as a humble and devoted servant of God, blessed with wisdom beyond measure. Under his leadership, Israel flourished, becoming a beacon of peace, wealth, and influence. His name became synonymous with wisdom, and his reign marked a golden age for the kingdom of Israel. But Solomon's story is not just about the achievements of a great king. It is also a cautionary tale about the dangers of pride, temptation, and turning away from God. Despite the gifts and blessings he had been given, Solomon allowed his heart to be led astray by his wealth, power, and the influence of foreign gods. His desire for more wealth, more power, more wives, ultimately led him down a path of disobedience that cost him the favor of God and the unity of his kingdom. One of the most important lessons we can learn from Solomon's life is the value of wisdom. Solomon's request for wisdom was a testament to his understanding of what truly matters in life. He knew that wealth and power were fleeting, but wisdom, the ability to discern right from wrong and to lead with justice, was a gift that would last forever. Throughout his early reign, Solomon's wisdom brought peace and prosperity to Israel, and his judgments became the standard by which rulers were measured. But wisdom alone is not enough. True wisdom comes from a heart that is fully devoted to God. Solomon's downfall came not because he lacked intelligence or insight, but because his heart became divided. He allowed the distractions of wealth, foreign alliances, and the desires of his flesh to pull him away from his devotion to the Lord. In the end, his wisdom could not save him from the consequences of his disobedience. Solomon's story reminds us that no matter how blessed or successful we may be, we must remain humble and obedient to God. It was humility that led Solomon to ask for wisdom in the first place, but as his power and influence grew, that humility began to fade. The more he achieved, the more he sought, and the more he sought, the further he drifted from the path of righteousness. This is a lesson for all of us. No amount of success can replace the importance of walking in obedience to God. Another key lesson from Solomon's life is the danger of compromise. Solomon's decision to marry foreign women and allow them to worship their gods was a direct violation of God's commandments. What began as small compromises, building altars for his wives' great gods, soon spiraled into full-blown idolatry, as Solomon himself began to turn away from the Lord. His story teaches us that even the smallest compromises can lead to devastating consequences. We must guard our hearts and remain steadfast in our commitment to God, resisting the temptations that can lead us astray. The final lesson from Solomon's life comes from his reflections in the book of Ecclesiastes. In his later years, Solomon looked back on his life and all he had accomplished, and he realized that it was all meaningless without God. "Vanity of vanities, all is vanity," he wrote. He had built magnificent palaces, amassed great wealth, and achieved more than any king before him. But in the end, he understood that none of it mattered in the face of eternity. The only thing that truly matters, Solomon concluded, is to fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man.